Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Caprice DeLillo. I'm the manager of the Maryland department here at Pratt Central Library location. And tonight we're going to be talking about some of Maryland's monsters of legend. I will say, if any of you are here to get really scared, this is not so much a scary program. We're going to be talking more about these creatures and sort of their social and cultural history. So like how they came to be, why they're here. But you can also take from it whatever you want. If you choose to believe, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, and I'm not going to tell you how I feel about it, just because I feel like that would take away the allure a little bit, right? And I like to start with an admission. I'm not from Maryland. I didn't grow up in Maryland. Though at this point I've been here longer than anywhere else in my life. I spent my childhood in Florida. You probably know that there are also a lot of crazy stories down in Florida, and we've got our own weird monsters down there. But tonight we're going to be talking about Maryland's monsters. Okay, so I've always been fascinated by the idea of folklore and legends and kind of how they came to be. As children, we know them as things that we hear about when we're sitting with our friends around a campfire. These are fun stories that provide us with a jolt of adrenaline and maybe help us to kind of bond us to our peers. But as we get older, we begin to recognize some of these legends' other purposes. Parents have used folklore and legends for centuries to keep their kids under control, of course, but there's also more insidious purposes. Stories are used to further political agendas or even as tools to subjugate marginalized people, of course. We've done a lot of things to subjugate marginalized people, and why should folklores be any different than that? And no, we won't be getting into any of these tonight. There's plenty of stories about enslaved individuals worrying about mythical monsters if they leave their enslavers' property, of course. And the monsters that we're going to be looking at in this presentation are being reported on after slavery was abolished, but that doesn't mean that they weren't still being used as tools of subjugation. And we're going to explore some of these ideas tonight, alongside hearing fun stories about some make-believe ghosts, or are they make-believe? Okay, so we are going to begin our exploration directly following the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the 20th century. And Teddy was an avid hunter, and he planned to spend his anticipated free time hunting as much as possible. And though he had planned a trip to Africa for this purpose, he'd recently been told about a target a little bit closer to home that he might want to look into. The story goes that following the inauguration of the incoming president, William H. Taft, the former president and the newly sworn-in president chatted about the job, as well as what Roosevelt wanted to do now that he was rid of the stressful position and had all this free time on his hands. And Taft knew that Roosevelt had intended to go to Africa, so he brought it up expecting to hear about the plans. But Roosevelt surprised him when he said that he'd recently decided to postpone the trip so that he could do something else first. He'd heard about a creature that none of his hunting peers had managed to nab, and what a great catch this would be. The snallygaster had recently been showing up in newspapers. And because there had been several sightings, around this time, he'd been being reported on in various places. And imagine how envious everybody would be if Roosevelt could display a mounted snallygaster, in his parlor. And by the way, this print, which I love, is by Jonathan Dodd, and it's available for purchase from the American Snallygaster Museum's website. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the American Snallygaster's website. I had never heard of it until I started doing my research, but it's pretty fun. You should check it out, and they've got some great merch. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I figured if I'm going to use the image, I should probably send a little business his way, right? So the snallygaster has been described with a number of different characteristics, but most commonly it's described as an enormous flying beast that has a sharp beak, talons like a bird of prey, or claws like a cat, and a long pointy tail. It's often described as having a single eye and octopus tentacles coming out of its mouth, which seems to me like it would make it more difficult for it to eat, but you know, I don't know. According to legend, the snallygaster's existence in Maryland dates back to the 18th century when German settlers began migrating to Western Maryland, specifically the Middletown area in Frederick County. And Germans had comparable beasts, as you can see from these illustrations from Friedrich Justin Bertach's Bilderbuch für Kinder, which translates to picture book for children. Which was published sometime at the end of the 1700s or early 1800s. And in fact, the name snallygaster may originate from the German term term Schnellergeist, which translates roughly to fast ghost or quick spirit. And snallygasters were said to mostly eat farm animals or small unattended children. But they were also sometimes blamed for taking items people misplaced, breaking into homes, moving or taking things. And you'll see in a bit that they also had a taste for a certain type of people over other people. Now, interestingly, the Jersey Devil, which some of you may have heard of, and an illustration of which appears here on the slide on the left-hand side, it had begun appearing, actually, it had been appearing, I don't know if it had begun, but it had been appearing in the US around the same time as the snallygaster in the South Jersey and Philadelphia region. And this particular sketch appeared in a 1909 article in the Philadelphia Bulletin. And we can see similarities in their appearance between the snallygaster and the Jersey Devil. The head and legs appear more like a horse on the Jersey Devil than they do on the snallygaster. And the year 1909 is a significant one, as this is when this sort of wave of sightings of both the Jersey Devil and the snallygaster began appearing. And there may have been mentions of the Jersey Devil prior to 1909, but I haven't seen any reports referring to Maryland's particular beast as the snallygaster before this year. And in fact, according to Susan Fair's Mysteries and Lore of Western Maryland, the term snallygaster was likely invented in 1909 by two staffers at the Middletown Valley Register, which is a paper that started in the mid-1800s. And interestingly, I put the dictionary definition up there. The term snallygaster didn't show up in Merriam-Webster's dictionary until 1967. And you know, like I said, it's on the slide here, and we can see that the definition is, quote, a mythical nocturnal creature that's reported chiefly from rural Maryland, is reputed to be part reptile and part bird, and it's said to prey on poultry and chicken. And before the Valley Register's articles referring to a snallygaster, there are reports of a vampire-like beast further west in like Cumberland, Hagerstown area, and even into Shepherdstown, West Virginia. But the beast isn't given a name in those articles. It isn't actually given the name snallygaster until 1909. So the first time it's referred to as a snallygaster in the Valley Register was in a piece reportedly written by a local man and published in February 12th, 1909. And this is the one on the left-hand side. And don't worry, I'll get to the troubling title to the piece shortly. But the man mentions the reports in New Jersey from earlier in January and of what was presumably the Jersey Devil, and he warns that that this beast is probably headed our way. He says that the man who saw it described it as a sort of cross between a vampire, a tiger, and a bovopolis. Right, exactly. A what? So, by the way, from what I've been able to determine, a bovopolis is a mythical creature that's a cross between some sort of bovine and a wolf. Lupus or lupus is Latin for wolf. And as you might imagine, there's not a lot of information about bovopolises out there, so it's kind of hard to come by that information. The article's description continues, quote, "It has an enormous wings, a long pointed bill, 4 legs armed with claws like steel hooks, 1 eye in the center of its forehead, and it screeches like a locomotive whistle." The article also reports that it killed an African-American man by piercing him through the jugular with its needle-like bill and slowly sucking his blood while fanning him with its giant wings. And in fact, the article goes on to state that the beast only targets African-Americans because it is a native of Senegambia, where only, quote, colored people live. And so it's never acquired a taste for white people. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So Senegambia, by the way, was the name formerly used for the part of West Africa that includes modern-day Senegal, the Gambia, and Mali. And the beast also seemed to prefer men to women. The article includes an interesting detail. The hide of the beast is said to be worth $100,000, which in today's money would equal almost $3.5 million. And the reason it's worth so much is because it's the only, quote, only thing known that can properly polish punctal shells used by Africans of Umbop land for ornaments. As far as I can tell, punctal shells are not a real thing, though they may have meant puka shell. I did look at a bunch of different English language dictionaries published in the early 20th century. I didn't find the word punctal, but I should also say that I didn't find the word puka in any of those dictionaries either. So, you know, I did find puka in recent ones. I didn't find punctal in any of them. So who knows? Who knows? And in case you haven't already guessed, Umbop land is a totally made up place. It sounds made up, of course, but just to be sure, I did check a bunch of gazetteers and I didn't find any listings for Umbop land. The same article goes on to say that another gentleman saw the snallygaster near Burkittsville, where it laid an egg the size of a barrel. And then finally, it states that the government is going to be sending a troop of soldiers out to kill the monster, but that the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. would prefer that it be captured alive. There's a brief mention of President Roosevelt's interest in it, which is likely how that particular story came to be. And so, you know, we're getting a lot of really strange details in this article. So interest in the snallygaster, weirdly enough, after this sort of wave of articles, died down at the end of 1909. And we don't see a whole lot more about it until the 1930s. And then in 1932, articles about the snallygaster's exploits resumed. In one article, a 10-year-old boy claimed to be keeping it in his cellar, though the article goes on to say that it was likely just a large owl. And in another article, a well-known Middletown man claimed that he'd been traveling with another man when the two saw the snallygaster flying about 25 feet in the air, and that the wingspan appeared to be about 12 feet. The article states that many think the snallygaster's made up, but those who believe in it the most are local African Americans. And if that's true, we can see why, based on those early accounts from 1909, right? And in perhaps the most well-known and quoted article, there are a couple of moonshiners that claim to have found the snallygaster dead in a vat of moonshine when arriving for work one day. You know, this was in the December 2nd edition of in 1939, or sorry, 32 of the Middletown Valley Register. And believers were hoping that this would mark the end of its terror. And snallygaster reports popped up here and there over the years. None of the articles seemed to take themselves as seriously as the sightings in those the earlier articles did, and they didn't seem to come in waves like they had in those earlier years. So let's talk a little bit about why we think maybe these articles that claim sightings came in waves in 1909 and 1932, right? Because it seems weird. There would, all these articles in 1909, then nothing, and then all these articles again in 1932. So in the book Maryland Legends, Folklore from the Old Line State, Trevor Blank and David Puglia say in an article about the snallygaster that both of these waves of sightings corresponded conveniently with major events taking place in the US, which isn't surprising. Those first articles from 1909 certainly attracted a greater attention for the paper, which of course is always going to be a good thing, selling more issues. But it also coincided with some political battles at the time. One such political battle was fought when state Democrats proposed the Straus Amendment to the Maryland Constitution. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Straus Amendment at all. So the Straus Amendment was one of a few amendments that were being proposed at that time that were specifically being proposed to disenfranchise African American voters. I feel like not a lot has changed. We're still seeing those kinds of things, right? So this amendment, the Straus Amendment, followed Democrats regaining control of Maryland in 1909 on a racist platform. And Democrats then went on to maintain control of the state for over a decade. In fact, the Democratic Party has historically been the dominant party in Maryland. We know that today, but you may not know the first 6 Democratic national conventions were held in Baltimore. And following the adoption of Maryland's new constitution in 1867, 28 of the state's 31 governors have been Democrats. 17 out of 23 Maryland comptrollers have been Democrats. 23 of the state's attorney generals out of 33 have been Democrats. And the party has held continuous control of the Maryland General Assembly since 1920, which is the longest currently running streak of control by a single party of a state legislature in the United States. But keep in mind that the Democratic Party didn't become more progressive with regard to civil rights until the middle of the 20th century. So it was a totally different party back then. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, right? He was the first Republican president, and he was elected solely by the northern and western states, and no support in the South. And although Maryland was split during the Civil War, culturally in many ways, it's a southern state with southern sensibilities. So while the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote, was adopted in 1870, Black voters, of course, continued to struggle with significant hurdles to vote, of course. And the Straus Amendment, which was proposed in 1908, so just 1 year before all of these snallygaster sightings started coming in waves, the Straus Amendment was actually the second in what would be 3 major early 20th century proposals, as I mentioned, to amend the Maryland state constitution in an attempt to restrict African Americans' right to vote based on things like ancestry and property ownership. So given what was going on in Maryland and given that it had the support of many in power, it's not surprising the focus on African Americans when creating a tale of a terrible beast who could swoop down and wreak havoc on African American men in particular. If you're a Black man and you're alive at that time, and maybe you're sort of on the fence, you've never voted before, of course, and you're on the fence about whether or not to go out and vote, the prospect that you could be plucked from the street and killed by a, a giant flying beast might be just the deterrent that you would need to stay home. And there was really no reason to suggest that African American women would be targeted, right? I mean, women in general weren't given the right to vote until 1920, after the adoption of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. So that's a little bit of interesting context for the 1909 articles. What about the articles from the 1930s? Any guesses? No guesses? Okay. Well, I'll say there was at least one article, this one that I have up here from the Montgomery County Sentinel, that continued to claim that the snallygaster was only interested in Black men. And there's this one part of the article that I found interesting. The article goes on to say near the end that, quote, some say that the snallygaster appears after every election when the results show that the colored voter cast his ballot for a Democrat, and that others say that is just a GOP fairy tale. And it goes on to talk about the assertion we saw back in 1909 about it being from Africa originally. So, at this point, we're not even skirting around the election in the article anymore, right? We're addressing it directly. But most of the articles from 1932 don't mention anything about its dietary preferences. But remember that mention of it dying in a vat of moonshine, right? So this might be interesting to readers because 1932 was just 1 year before the repeal of the 18th Amendment, which had established a nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. So could the snallygaster's death in a vat of moonshine be a metaphor or a warning for what we maybe could expect to happen if we allowed this evil allure of alcohol back into society? Who knows? But it does seem kind of coincidental. So the question over whether or not reports of the snallygaster began in the 18th century with the arrival of German immigrants or was a modern 20th century invention, it seems kind of clear to me, as well as the authors of many of the sources I read about the snallygaster. Most say that it's first mentioned in 1909, and as said, I haven't found any earlier newspaper articles. Blank and Puglia, who wrote that book that I previously mentioned, state in their book that the legend of the snallygaster falls squarely within the realm of what folklorists call fake lore. And fake lore is a term that was coined by well-known folklorist and Professor Richard M. Dorson in his 1950 article, Folklore and Fake Lore, published in the American Mercury. In it, he debates with another author, James Stephens, about the origin of Paul Bunyan. Fake lore is used to describe what are essentially manufactured stories that are presented as traditional folklore. So, for instance, Dorson talks about Cowboy Pecos Bill, who was presented as a hero of the American West, but was actually invented by a writer in 1923. As I just mentioned, Paul Bunyan, who Dorson claimed was invented in the early 20th century by an ad writer working for the Red River Lumber Company. So essentially, Dorson's saying that, Paul Bunyan was just an ad for this company. And interestingly, Richard Dorson also coined the term urban legend, which we hear a lot more often nowadays than we hear folklore, right? And I would argue actually a lot of these monsters probably fall more into the urban legend category than they do into the folklore category, but although I'm unsure whether the 18th century German, where it came from, that German origin story, the fact that the snallygaster's origins have been described in such great detail seems to support the theory that the snallygaster legend falls more into this fake lore category than folklore. But whenever we were introduced to the snallygaster, or whatever the reason for its creation, it's clear the beast made an impact in the area, at least for a time. It was mentioned in newspaper articles over the years, even into the 21st century, though less frequently than earlier reports. And its appearance and predilections have evolved over the years, and like many of its cryptid cousins, which you'll see later in my presentation, the snallygaster's found its way into pop culture, of course. There's an album by Frederick County indie rock band, The Skeptics, called Snallygaster, which was released in the 1980s. The snallygaster shows up in several Fred Flintstone books from the 1970s. I think it's a really weird depiction of the snallygaster. It's essentially just a lion with wings and a propeller on its nose. Very weird. I'm not sure where that came from. There was even a drink invented in the 1960s called the snallygaster, which was an ice cream float made with vanilla ice cream and Mountain Dew. Doesn't sound all that good to me, but I don't know. I don't know. All right, so now we're going to move on to our next legendary monster, who also hails from the Frederick County area and actually has a connection to the snallygaster. The Dueyo, which is seen here in a sketch by Frederick County News Post artist Ed Mull, was based on a description by a man by the name of John Becker. And Becker wrote into the newspaper after he said he witnessed the beast. The Dueyo has been described as a dog or wolf-like creature who stands on two legs, was about 6 feet tall, with black fur and a long bushy tail. And toward the end of 1965, the Dueyo started appearing in Frederick newspapers. And that aforementioned John Becker contacted the newspaper at the end of November to report that he'd been attacked by the Dueyo and had to fight it off. He said he lived close to Frederick on a road by the name of Fern Rock Road. And according to the article's author, the newspaper contacted the local state police, who said that there was not only no such thing as a Dueyo, of course, but that there was also no such road in Frederick County, and there was no one by the name of John Becker living there. So it was chalked up to be a hoax. The article then goes on to state that the police have provided no instructions on what hunters should do if they're out hunting game and they encounter a Dueyo. And it concludes by quoting the police officer, quote, "No one actually knows if there's such an animal or thing as a Dueyo, but if there is, and there's always a chance, as soon as the Russians hear about it, they'll claim they had it first." So, whoops, let's go back a little bit. So, you know, of course, we're right in the middle of the Cold War here in 1965. So right off the bat, George May, staff writer for the Frederick News, was clearly having fun with this whole thing, right? 2 days later, the Dueyo was still on the loose. And again, George May of the Frederick News reported that a hunter had now seen the beast. The paper had started receiving worried calls about the possibility that they might encounter it, but the paper also quoted a Frederick man who said he wasn't worried at all and that he thought maybe perhaps this John Becker might be getting into the holiday spirits a little early. This was the article that featured this super lifelike drawing that you see here by the paper's sketch artist as well. But my favorite part of the article is the final 2 paragraphs. A 4-year-old boy told the paper that he knew for certain there was such a thing as a Dueyo and that he'd seen loads of them. When asked where he'd seen them, the boy looked around, made a sweeping motion with his arm and said, "Everywhere." So over the next couple of weeks, there were several more articles detailing reported sightings, all written by Frederick News staff writer George May, and they seemed to get more and more and more ridiculous. On December 2nd, the police received a call from a man claiming that he had captured the Dueyo a year ago and he'd been keeping it in his basement. Rather than the originally reported 6-foot-tall beast, his Dueyo was only about 2 feet tall. So he thought it must be a baby Dueyo, just like, or a dog. I mean, police actually followed up on that call with a visit to the address provided, but it turned out to be a prank. The man who answered the door seemed to have absolutely no idea what they were talking about, and he certainly didn't have a dueo in his basement. The article goes on to mention other sightings, as well as people hearing screaming like a woman and crying like a baby. And then this particular article ends with a mention of a black bear in the area that had been terrorizing residents, with a follow-up quote by a man who says that the bear who had been terrorizing residents was likely his poodle, who was often mistaken for a bear. I don't know. Then we begin to hear speculation in another article that the dueo could be the offspring of the snallygaster. So I mentioned they might have a connection. We see another Frederick County resident positing that because the snallygaster's eggs take 20 years to hatch, now would be the time for their offspring to emerge. And while the dueo had curiously never been mentioned in those earlier articles about the snallygaster, the egg laying had, right? They had said something about an egg being laid the size of a barrel. And interestingly, I've also seen mention of the dueo being the mortal enemy of the snallygaster in some of the things that I've read, rather than as offspring, though I haven't seen that theory in any newspaper articles. I've only seen it in secondary sources, so I'm not sure exactly where that information came from. And then on December 6th, we have an official hunt for the dueo announced. However, no one seemed to have any idea who was organizing the hunt, and there was speculation that the whole thing was another hoax. But the more interesting part of this December 6th article is the report that John Becker, the original resident who had written to the paper to say that he had to fight off that dueo, and of course the one that police were saying didn't exist in Frederick County, was now saying that he wasn't sure exactly what it was that he had tangled with. He states that he had used a fictitious name so that he could maintain his anonymity. Probably not the worst idea when you're reporting a beast called a dueo. And he says there's no dueo as such, but he definitely fought with a beast as large as a bear that looked like a dog. He says he believes that it's in the best interest of the public for a search party to locate the animal and destroy it before it hurts someone. And then the article goes on to quote several children who speculate that it may be a rabid Irish wolfhound or a cross between a dog and a wolf. And if you remember what the sketch looks like, an Irish wolfhound or a dog-wolf hybrid are actually pretty good guesses. I don't know why Becker would have decided to give the animal a fabricated name or chosen the name dueo. I don't know. But, you know, that's anyone's guess, I guess. And then the final article I found from 1965 came out on December 15th, and it's probably the most absurd of them all. It begins, "All I want for Christmas is a dueo," and it ends with a poem composed by a woman employed at the American Optical Plant in Frederick. "Santa's coming in on a dueo, and a jolly ho ho ho. For Rudolph has the virus, cold in his bright red nose. So please don't hurt the dueo. Tell everyone you know that Santa needs his help this year because it doesn't look like snow." Now the dueo is a puppy that grew and grew and grew, and like poor little Rudolph, his friends are very few. But Santa is the kindest one and knew that they were sad. Now the dueo is the newest friend, so let us all be glad. So yeah, that's fun. So although the origins of Maryland's dogman, the dueo, seem fairly obvious, its legend does actually catch on, at least for a couple of decades. There's a couple of articles about it in the 1970s, and even an account reported by a woman to a local pastor as well as late as 2009. And finally, before we move on from the dueo, I just want to say that dogmen are not unique in the world of folklore and cryptids. The most well-known probably is the werewolf, of course. There have been reports of dogmen all over the country and, of course, in other parts of the world. We see a few of them on the slide, but this is not by any means all of them out there. And even in Maryland, we've had other dog hybrid type animal sightings reported. There was this gnarly yow in Western Maryland, which is also sometimes referred to as the dog fiend. There's also stories of a phantom dog in various parts of the state as early as the 18th or 19th century. However, the name Dueño doesn't seem to begin being used until that November 1965 article. And it's not a stretch to imagine a scenario where a hunter or some other unsuspecting individual might encounter a large rabid dog or a mangy wolf. And we as humans, we have a strong need to rationalize what we see, especially when it doesn't make sense to us and maybe we don't have the language to explain what we're seeing in kind of a scientific way. But could dog-man hybrids actually exist? Probably not, but maybe. According to a 2011 study that appeared in a scientific journal, the authors estimate that there are still roughly 86% of the Earth's terrestrial species and 91% of its marine species yet to be discovered. So I will leave it up to you whether or not you believe in the snallygaster, the dueño, or any of the following creatures that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to move on to our next creature. All right, so one of the most commonly reported mythical beasts in the world, of course, is the large human, hairy human or ape-like creature alleged by some to inhabit forests, particularly along the Pacific Northwest in the US. They're known by many names, such as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the abominable snowman, or the skunk ape in the US, or the Mapinguari in Brazil, the Yowie in Australia, or the Almas or Yeti, depending on the region in Asia. But my question to you once again, are they real? So the majority of the sightings reported in the United States, as I said, are primarily in the Pacific Northwest, especially in Washington state. And those who study Bigfoot sightings surmise that this is probably because of the vast expanses of undisturbed and undeveloped land in that area, as well as it being less densely populated. So this would allow the creatures to migrate north and south more easily, depending on the time of year, without encountering as many humans. However, there have been sightings on the East Coast as well, and not surprisingly, there have been many sightings in Maryland too. Humans around the world have been reporting encounters with ape men, I should say, for thousands of years. And in the Americas, indigenous people told tales of meetings with similar creatures too. Here in Maryland, early indigenous tribes worshipped a monstrous spirit that took the shape of different animals. And according to an early 17th century account by John Smith, the Piscataway people called this spirit Oki, and they served him more out of fear than love, and they attempted to fashion themselves as near to his image as possible. And what you see on this slide is from the published Travels and Works of Captain John Smith, 1580 to 1637. And author Mark Opsasnick writes in his book, The Maryland Bigfoot Digest, a survey of creature sightings in the Free State, that some native Marylanders still believe in Oki as a Bigfoot-type creature. Opsasnick also describes a hair-covered, tall, ape-like creature standing on two legs in a map that appears in George Alsop's 1666 account of his time in Maryland. The book is called A Character of the Province of Maryland. And this is the map. And I'm assuming that this is the creature that he's referring to. It looks to me more like a bear standing on its hind legs, but it is kind of a strange way to depict it given the way that the rest of the animals are depicted on the map. So I don't know. There have been a lot of reported sightings over the years, and if you want a more complete timeline, I'd encourage you to check out Opsasnick's book, The Maryland Bigfoot Digest. Almost a third of the book is a very detailed account of like every single sighting that has happened over decades and decades. But I'm going to skip ahead to the 20th century and talk about some more sightings of Bigfoot-like creatures in Maryland. Earlier references to sightings of ape-like creatures around the turn of the century often referred to these creatures as the wild men. And wild men were spotted in Baltimore metropolitan area and Dorchester County. Even H.L. Mencken got in on the fun, making up tales of a wild man on the loose in Baltimore County, which unfortunately led to the arrest of a man who was unhoused. In Cecil County in the early 1950s, there were a series of reports to the local sheriff's office of a gorilla-like creature who stood on two legs and was about 6 feet tall. Before any eyewitnesses were willing to come forward with their names, the sheriff's office issued a statement that the reports were, of course, false. However, they were forced to admit that a large gorilla-like animal being loose was a, quote, definite possibility when several people came forward with credible stories. The 1970s and 80s were absolutely filled with Bigfoot sightings all over the state. I personally was growing up during this time, and I read constantly about Bigfoot. That and the Bermuda Triangle, you know, all of those things that were very popular in the 70s, 60s, or the 70s and the 80s. So people reported seeing what they thought were men dressed in gorilla costumes in Prince George's County during this period. In Bel Air, a man reported striking a large ape-like creature walking on two legs with a sports car. Near Middle River, a foul-smelling Bigfoot was reported rifling through the trash and peering into the windows of several people's homes. And perhaps my favorite of the Bigfoot reports from this time period is the Sykesville monster. Now, as the name suggests, this beast was mostly reported by folks living in Carroll County, but it was also seen in Harford and Baltimore counties as well. And while Sykesville is only located about 15 miles from Baltimore city limits, in 1973, it was a town with a still relatively small population. The first newspaper report of the Sykesville monster showed up in the Sykesville Herald in May of that year. And it told of a resident who'd called the police after seeing an enormous creature in the woods behind his property. He described the creature as 7 to 8 feet tall with glowing eyes. And neither the responding officer nor the chief of police, who reported to the scene a few days later, saw the creature, but they did find trees and brush disturbed by something that was obviously large, and they found footprints that were about 13 inches long and about 6 inches wide and appeared to be from a bare foot. Their position on the ground suggested that whatever made the prints had a stride of over 6 feet. And just for context, a normal human stride is about 3 feet. So local police determined, based on a few different factors, that it was unlikely that the prints were made as a joke by someone, and plaster casts were made of the footprints. So while people in Sykesville were initially skeptical, additional reports to police in the Sykesville Herald began coming in. They started getting reports from other residents. There was even a BGE employee working in the area who spotted the creature. It was further described as having brown and gray fur, an egg-shaped head, and walking on two legs, in addition to the previous report of it being 7 to 8 feet tall with glowing eyes. Police officers and game wardens investigated each report, and while they didn't find the creature, they did find more footprints. And of course, again, law enforcement took a reserve position and stated that, that they believed it was either a prowler or a wild animal that was frightened by all the activity. And they asked citizens to remain calm and to stay in their homes in case, you know, in case it was something. They stressed the importance of their residents allowing law enforcement to search. And one article even stated that police were fearful of untrained people in the woods with firearms. And I don't blame them. I mean, a bunch of frightened people in the woods, many of which living in homes with at least one gun seems like a recipe for disaster to me, if I've ever heard one, but you know. So while the majority of the sightings were in May and June of 1973, there have been a handful of sightings in the years since, and the mystery of what the Sykesville monster was has never been explained. I actually have a friend who grew up in Sykesville, and while he wasn't yet alive in 1973, he's told me that people, including his parents, who were living in Sykesville at the time, still talk about the Sykesville monster and whether or not it was real. So people still argue about this. And some residents thought maybe it was a wayward bear or an escaped gorilla or a wandering patient from the nearby Springfield State Psychiatric Hospital. Still, some emphatically believe that it was a Bigfoot. And though there have been Bigfoot sightings reported all over the state, the highest concentration seems to be in Harford County. And those who research Bigfoot sightings believe that this is because the breeding territory for these creatures is within those dense forests between the Gunpowder Falls and the Susquehanna rivers. And perhaps because there have been so many sightings in the Harford County area, Maryland's preeminent Bigfoot investigator, Bob Chance, hails from Harford County. You probably didn't know we had a preeminent Bigfoot investigator here in Maryland. And I can say, Mr. Chance is no kook. He spent his career as an environmentalist, scientist, and naturalist. He taught science to high school students, everything from ecology and earth sciences to herpetology and wildlife tracking. He was trail master for the Susquehanna Greenway Trail. He wrote a nature column called Earthline in the Aegis newspaper for many years, and he served as both town commissioner and mayor of Bel Air. So it's a fairly educated man. He's also been researching Bigfoot type creatures for over 50 years. So for many years, he's the man to call if you see a Bigfoot. And from what I've read about him, his interest in the environment and the natural world has always included both endangered wildlife and unknown animals. He keeps an open mind about the existence of various cryptozoological creatures, even incorporating discussions about them into his high school class lectures, which I think is really interesting and would have kept me interested if I were one of his students. And actually, when he was in his 20s in the early 1970s, he even had his own run-in with what he thought might have been a Bigfoot. So Chance has stated that his greatest fear is that a Bigfoot will be shot and mounted by a hunter before scientists are able to confirm their existence. He would love to find one, sedate it long enough to study it, and maybe even outfit it with a radio transmitter. Okay, so I want to end this section with a quote from Bob Chance. "I'm a dreamer. I like to think that not everything on the planet has been categorized, and there's still some pocket of natural history and wilderness that hasn't yet been discovered. It might be there, it might not be there. It may be a bogus fairy tale I'm tracking, but I think not. Sometimes I find myself thinking that in the future, someone will find this thing and say, that thing Chance was talking about 25 years ago is really out there." Okay, now we are going to move on to our next creature. Some of you may have heard about him. So the backstory of the goat man of Prince George's County differs depending on who you're talking to. He may have been escaped from a tuberculosis sanitarium at Glendale Hospital. He may be a science experiment mishap that happened at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, or even a scientist who performed experiments on goats at the center. Or he may have been a goatherd who lived as a hermit among his goats for so long that he began to resemble them. Some even claim that he was a goatherd who was mistreated by local teenagers who killed his herd and drove him insane, causing him to stalk the woods as Goat Man, preying on teens as revenge. But no matter the backstory of the beast itself, the trajectory of the legend of Prince George's County goat man is well documented. Its rise in popularity can be traced to a few specific events. In the spring of 1971, a University of Maryland student named George Lizama collected oral history interviews as part of a project for his introduction to folklore class. Lizama, who was actually only 21 at the time, interviewed people, friends, family, about the legend. And he was well acquainted with the legend because it was local to his hometown. At the time, the Clinton Oxon Hill area was in the process of transforming from a rural, somewhat sparsely populated area to what would become part of the DC suburbs. And the stories that Lizama collected of the goat man varied a bit, but they had a mostly common theme. The goat man was an old hermit who was half goat, half man, and had previously been a goat herder. He lived in a shack near a one-lane bridge on a dark, narrow, and treacherous road called Tucker Road in Clinton. And during a full moon, he would stand at the bridge and throw bricks or rocks at passing cars, sometimes damaging them or forcing them off the road. And finally, most of those interviewed stated that while they had personally never seen the goat man, they knew someone who had, right? I feel like that's a common urban legend thing that you hear. So after the project was turned in and graded and all of that, Lizama's professor then placed his final project along with a bunch of other final projects that this same professor had collected. And Lizama's project was called The Goat Man of Tucker Road, and it was placed in the Maryland Folklore Collection in the University of Maryland Special Collections and Archives. When the paper was submitted, the collection was quite small. It's since grown to about 140 linear feet. And I should say that the box that you see on the top there is considered to be about 1 linear foot. So you can imagine roughly 140 to 150 of those boxes is what the collection now consists of. I visited the collection. It's located at the Hornbeck Library on the University of Maryland's College Park campus. And you can actually see the box that Lizama's project is in on the slide on the left-hand side, as well as his project spread out on the right. And of course, there's no way that Lizama or his professor could have known the effect that his project would have on the legend. But just a few months later, after Lizama's paper was added to the Maryland Folklore Collection, Karen Hostler, a reporter for the Prince George's County News, visited the collection looking for inspiration for a spooky story for Halloween. She found Lizama's paper, and she published the first of several stories related to Goatman on October 27th, 1971. For whatever reason, she changed the location from Tucker Road in Clinton to Fletchertown Road in Bowie, Maryland. And Hostler stated in the article that the Goatman legend was, quote, an old one that periodically dies down, then revives. So it seems the legend, of course, was already around and that she had heard of it. And while many others in the area had also heard the Goatman story, it's likely that she introduced it to even more locals with her article. In fact, not long after Article's first article came out, a Bowie teen reported that she and 2 friends had heard strange noises one night in her backyard, and they saw a hairy, 6-foot-high animal standing on 2 feet. The next day, trigger warning, this is very sad, they found her 10-month-old puppy, Ginger, who they noted had gone missing the night before, decapitated near the railroad tracks. Hostler published her second Goatman story in the Prince George's County News about the incident just a couple of weeks later. After that, or after her first article, I should say, calling it Residents Fear Goatman Lives, Dog Found Decapitated in Old Bowie. The article included a photograph of Ginger's head, but luckily the microfilm wasn't clear enough for me to see it. I don't feel like that was necessary to include, but And then that same month that Hostler's second article came out, reporter Ivan Goldman wrote about the goat man in the Washington Post. And now that he was appearing in a paper read nationwide, Goatman was introduced to a much larger audience. Thus began Goatman mania. Thrill-seeking teens and other legend trippers began trekking to PG County to try to catch a glimpse of the terrifying beast. Locals living in the areas in which he'd been reported grew tired of drunken littering and late-night disturbances. I remember doing these kind of strange things as a kid in Florida when, we would be told these weird stories. So I can only imagine what it was like for those poor folks living in that part of Prince George's County. And then Mark Obsasnik, who we heard about while talking about Bigfoot sightings and who I've spoken to, wrote in his book, The Real Story Behind the Exorcist, a study of the haunted boy and other true life horror legends from around the nation's capital, that one had to, quote, experience Goatman mania firsthand to fully comprehend the aura surrounding the creature and its stomping grounds. A few years later, reports of the Goatman moved once again, this time to Lotsford Road in Mitchellville. And interestingly, all three locations are now part of the DC metropolitan area, just east of the Capitol Beltway, as you can see on this map. And the Beltway was completed in 1964, which was not long before the Goatman reports started coming in. And it, of course, made traveling in and out of DC from neighboring towns easier. In this really interesting article, David Puglia argues in this essay called The Goatman in Washington, D.C., Strange Sightings and the Fear of the Encroaching City, which appears in the collection that is referenced on this slide here, that the rise in Goatman's popularity was, quote, an unconscious symbol for the psychological discontent the encroaching city had evoked in the surrounding rural area, especially in the 1970s, where reports of rising crime, an expanding city, and rapidly changing demographics had increased local anxieties. So before the Beltway, most of PG County was quite rural and culturally separate from Washington, D.C. However, over just a few decades during this early to mid 20th century, there was a development boom which increased the population tenfold. And demographics shifted from mostly white and rural to more Black and urban. And Puglia states that the Goatman legend was linked to anxiety about urban crime spreading to the county. So I'm not going to discuss in any detail here about the underlying racism that led to those fears. That could be an entire lecture of its own, and I'm not the person to do it. However, there's a lot of really great books about that topic, and you can read about it in detail. This racist ideology that framed African Americans as dangerous criminals following the abolition of slavery. And if you are interested in any of these books, the librarians here at Pratt Central can recommend some really great ones to you. That's kind of what we do, right? And also, if you're interested, I definitely recommend Puglia's essay. It's quite compelling, and he makes some really great points. He goes into quite a bit of detail about the perceived threat of the rise of crime in these previously rural areas versus the reality of the crime statistics and what the encroachment of the city to the outlying areas actually meant to residents, as well as how Goatman became a symbol of this perceived threat. And somewhat surprisingly, in my personal experience, when I've told folks about this research that I was doing for this presentation and the monsters that I've been covering, the Goatman was the one that most people had heard of. I actually hadn't heard of him before I started researching this. And again, that's probably because I'm not from Maryland originally, but he's pretty well known. And like other well-known cryptids, Goatman's made his way into mainstream popular culture, including print, screen, and the internet. He's appeared in popular magazines, on television, including the Discovery Channel's Animal X in 1997. He was in the X-Files comic book series in The Face of Extinction, and he even inspired several independent films, including Andrew Bowser's 2010 film Jimmy Tupper versus the Goatman of Bowie. I haven't seen it, so I can't recommend it, but it does look pretty fun. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to our final beast. And our final beast, Chessie, is probably the one that most of you have heard of, mainly because it's become a bit of a symbol for ecology and environmentalism in the Chesapeake Bay. I've read in several sources, including the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership website, that sightings first began sometime in the 1930s, though the beast hadn't received its adorable moniker yet at that time. Some reports state that in 1936, a military helicopter spotted some sort of large serpent-like animal swimming in Bush River, which is an estuary off of the Chesapeake Bay. And though it's been disputed that there were reports of sightings at this time, you know, I've read it in several places. Personally, I haven't been able to confirm any of this with newspaper articles or any other primary sources, so I'm not sure where they got their information or if this is some more of this sort of fake lore. I don't know. I did find at least one 19th century article from the Washington Post that refers to a sea serpent spotted in the Chesapeake Bay. It's hard to determine from the article whether it's a tongue-in-cheek expose referring to something else and comparing it to a sea serpent, or if the author was reporting on an actual sighting. Sometimes these old articles use this really flowery language and you really can't kind of tell exactly, you know, what their objective is. But I will say the fact that the author is referring to a sea serpent in the bay is interesting. And it seems to indicate that people were already thinking that we might have our own Loch Ness monster in the States. And the name Chessie is obviously a nod to our monster's more famous cousin, the Loch Ness monster, or Nessie, as it's commonly known. And there have been reports of Nessie since as early as the 6th century in the Scottish Highlands. Its lore is, of course, well known all over the world. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Loch Ness monster. And while Nessie is perhaps the best known of the giant sea serpents, it's certainly not alone. There have been reports of sightings for thousands of years all over the globe, and frightening depictions have shown up in traditional art and on historic maps. In fact, when sailors returned from sea explorations and adventures, giant sea serpent tales were often told alongside tales of mermaids and giant squids, which, by the way, were eventually proven to be real, and other deep sea monsters. So although there's evidence that there were earlier sightings, our Chessie seems to have sprung into the popular local consciousness in the 1970s after a series of articles reporting sightings by several different people. Sightings continued to come in great numbers through the mid-80s, and there are a lot of theories as to what Chessie might be. Some say that what people have actually seen is a manatee or a dolphin, maybe a creature descended from anaconda snakes that may have escaped ships abandoned in Baltimore, in the port of Baltimore, or even a surviving prehistoric creature called the zeuglodon. There was a theory that it was a mutant eel that may have been exposed to radiation from the nearby Calvert Cliffs nuclear power plant, or my personal favorite, which you see here on the screen, a bag of kids. So whatever the origins of the creature, it seems that there have even been some in power who have taken the reports seriously. In 1984, State Senator George Della of Baltimore, then a member of the state's Senate Economics and Environmental Affairs Committee drafted a resolution to, quote, encourage serious inquiry by the state into Chessie and other unusual animals in the Chesapeake Bay. So as you might imagine, he was ridiculed for this proposal, but he stated that for over 20 years, he'd been receiving letters from concerned citizens about Chessie. So it would only make sense that he'd want to address it. And there have been sightings here and there over the years, but Chessie mostly seems to have settled into a cute, anthropomorphic, cartoon-like creature, primarily used to teach kids about the bay, or as a logo for local events and other types of things. And before I end the presentation, I just want to plug something. I didn't spend as much time researching Chessie as I did the other monsters I covered tonight, but if you want to hear more about Chessie, you can read Eric Cheesham's excellent book, Chessie, A Cultural History of the Chesapeake Bay Sea Monster, which was published last year. And you can also hear him speak. He came last year and did a talk for us for our Let's Talk About Maryland series, and it's available to watch on our YouTube. So if you have any interest at all, he was fantastic and funny, and he went into detail about sort of, you know, all of these strange sightings and where they took place. And I mean, it was a really good presentation. And that is all I have for this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you maybe learned something. Before I open it up for questions, I just want to let you know very quickly, this is the second in the Maryland Department's series, The Dark Side of Maryland. Last Tuesday, we held a true crime program called Maryland Mayhem, which can now be, or is now being streamed on our Facebook page, and you can watch it there. Next Tuesday, October 21st at 6:30 p.m. in the same room, you can join us for Mediums, Magicians, and the Ouija Board, a spiritualist history of Baltimore. Then the following Monday, October 27th, back in this room, same time, we'll offer Haunted Maryland. It's supernatural, hun, where you can hear some spooky Maryland ghost stories. Then finally on Wednesday, October 29th, same room, same time, you can come hear about the history of witchcraft in Maryland with Witch's Brew, True Tales and Folklore of Witchcraft in Colonial Maryland. I hope you'll come back for some, if not all of them. And if you're not able to get here in person, you can watch them on the library's Facebook or YouTube pages. So does anybody have any questions? Mm-hmm. Not the resident. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. People getting beach houses and, you know, yeah. Or just moving there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Did you have a question? Which one? Oh, Peeping Tom. I did not study Peeping Tom, but he looks scary to me. I did. Yeah, you can look him up. Yeah, that's not one that I looked into. Maybe because he kind of creeped me out a little too much. All right, well, if there isn't any other questions, thank you for coming out. Thank you.